She was 22 years old, desperate, and about to board a train that would change everything. Not in the way she hoped, but in a way that would haunt her for the rest of her life. This is one of the darkest and most hidden chapters of the American West, and Sinister Empires is about to pull back the curtain on all of it. Dodge City, Kansas. Summer of 1878. The sun had been down for an hour, but the heat still pressed against the wooden buildings on Front Street, like a hand that refused to let go. A woman named Mattie Ross was standing behind a bar on the second floor of a dance hall, pouring whiskey into glasses that never seemed to stay full. 6 months ago, she had been in St. Louis, working 14-hour shifts in a textile mill for $3 a week, sleeping in a boarding house with 11 other women, eating boiled potatoes 6 days out of 7. She was hungry, exhausted, and desperate for something that looked like a future. Then one Tuesday morning, an advertisement appeared in the St. Louis Democrat. Wanted, young women of good character for waitress positions at a premier hotel in western Kansas. Room and board provided. Wages $12 a week. Train ticket furnished. $12 a week. For times what the mill paid, with no rent, no food costs, no boarding house fees eating into her wages before she could save a single dollar. Mattie showed up at room 14 of the Metropolitan Hotel the very next afternoon. The man waiting there wore a clean shirt and a decent suit. He spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had answered these exact questions many times before. The hotel was in Dodge City, he explained, a thriving cattle town where respectable young women were in high demand for legitimate hospitality work. He was polite. He was specific. The train left Friday. Could she be ready? She could. She packed everything she owned into a single carpet bag and boarded a westbound train alongside 4 other young women who had answered the same advertisement. None of them knew each other, but they talked the way strangers do when they share a direction but not yet a destination, trading small facts and large hopes. One woman from Illinois, one from Minnesota, all of them young, all of them poor, all of them choosing to believe they were traveling towards something better, because the alternative was too heavy to carry. The train reached Dodge City after 3 days. The man from room 14 was waiting at the station. He loaded their bags into a wagon and drove them, not to a hotel, but to a 2-story wooden building on Front Street, with a bar on the ground floor and a dance hall above it. No hotel sign, no lobby, just a long counter stained dark with spilled whiskey, a piano against a far wall, and men in cattle dust already drinking, though it was barely past noon. Mattie looked at the man from room 14. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who has stopped pretending and is simply waiting for you to catch up. Then, in that same calm voice he had used in St. Louis, he explained the situation, not as a revelation or trap, but as if he were still describing a reasonable opportunity. The train ticket had cost $22. That amount was now her debt to the owner of this establishment. Room and board would be charged weekly. Clothing suitable for work would be provided on credit. She would earn a commission on every drink she served, and every drink she persuaded a customer to buy. When the debt was cleared, she was free to go. Mattie asked how long that would take. The man smiled, the kind of smile that knows the answer and also knows it's the last thing you want to hear. He said it depended on how hard she worked. That was the first lie, not the advertisement, though the advertisement was also a lie. Not the clean shirt, the decent suit, or the calm voice in room 14, though those were lies too. The first lie that truly mattered was the one built into the arithmetic. The debt was not designed to be cleared. It was designed to grow. And Mattie would spend the next 6 months learning that lesson the way every woman in that building had learned it before her, one night at a time, one rig number at a time, until the truth settled into her bones like winter cold and became something she carried rather than something she fought. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because at Sinister Empires, we go deep into the stories history tried to bury, and this one is only just beginning. Before we follow Mattie further into that building on Front Street, before we expose the full machinery of the system that consumed her and thousands of women like her across the cattle towns of the American West, We need to go back to where this all started. Because what happened to Maddie Ross was not an accident. It was an economy built deliberately, operated ruthlessly, and hidden in plain sight. And none of this happened in secret, not behind locked doors, not in dark alleyways, but on Main Street, in buildings with lit windows and piano music drifting out into the night air, in towns where the sheriff drank at the bar, where the mayor collected taxes from the owner, and where the preacher walked past every single Sunday morning on his way to church, and never once stopped to ask what was happening to the women inside. This was not a criminal operation hiding from the law. This was the law. The saloon economy was the beating economic heart of the western cattle town, and the women inside those saloons were the fuel that heart burned through. What you are about to learn is the full anatomy of a system that recruited women through deception, imprisoned them through debt, and broke them through a series of carefully calculated stages, each one designed to strip away resistance one layer at a time, until there was nothing left to strip. Every stage had a name, every stage had a method, and every stage moved the woman one step closer to a grave that no one would visit and no one would mark. If you want to understand how human trafficking operated in broad daylight in American towns for decades without consequence, how a system this brutal hid itself behind piano music, swinging doors, and the myth of the free-spirited saloon girl, then you need to watch this entire video from beginning to end. Subscribe to Sinister Empires right now, and drop a comment telling me what you think you know about Western saloons, because I guarantee that by the end of this video, you will not recognize a picture. And stay until the final minutes, because the last stage of this pipeline is the one that Cattle Town tourism has spent 150 years trying to make sure you never learn about. To understand how the saloon pipeline operated, you first need to understand the world that created it. The Western Cattle Town was not a natural community. It was a machine built for a single purpose, extracting money from men passing through. And the fuel that powered that machine was the cattle drive. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the Texas cattle industry exploded. Millions of longhorns that had roamed semi-wild during the war years were suddenly worth real money in northern markets, where demand for beef far exceeded supply. The problem was distance. The cattle were in Texas. The railheads connecting to eastern markets were in Kansas. Between them lay hundreds of miles of open prairie that the herds had to cross on foot, driven by crews of cowboys who spent weeks, sometimes months, on the trail, living on coffee and salt pork, earning wages they had no way to spend until they reached the end of the line. The end of the line was places like Abilene, Dodge City, Ellsworth, Wichita, and Caldwell, towns that existed because the railroad existed, built precisely at the points where cattle trails met rail lines. When the herds arrived, the cowboys arrived with them, hundreds of young men carrying months of accumulated wages and an overwhelming hunger to spend those wages on three things the trail had denied them: alcohol, entertainment, and the company of women. The cattle towns organized themselves around providing all three with maximum efficiency and minimum restraint. At the peak of the cattle drive era, Dodge City's Front Street contained more saloons per block than any street in America. The town supported between 15 and 20 saloons simultaneously during the late 1870s, serving a permanent population of barely 1,000 people, but a transient population that swelled to several thousand during cattle season. The economics were staggering. A single busy saloon could generate more revenue in one cattle season than most Eastern businesses generated in an entire year. Whiskey bought wholesale for pennies a glass sold for 10 to 25 cents. Beer purchased by the barrel sold by the glass at markups that would have embarrassed a Wall Street speculator. And the women generated more revenue per square foot than anything else in the building. That was the critical economic reality that created the pipeline. Saloon owners were not marginal figures lurking on the fringes of respectable society. They were the wealthiest and most powerful men in their communities. They owned the buildings. They employed the workers. They paid the taxes that funded town government. They contributed to the campaigns of sheriffs and marshals who understood that their continued employment depended entirely on maintaining a working relationship with the men who kept the town solvent. In Dodge City, saloon owners sat on the town council. In Tombstone, they funded the construction of public buildings. In Deadwood, they essentially were the public buildings. The political and economic structure of the cattle town was inseparable from the saloon economy, and the saloon economy was inseparable from the women who worked inside it. The demand for those women was constant, enormous, and it had to be fed continuously. A busy saloon needed between 5 and 20 women, working every single night during cattle season. A town with 15 saloons needed over 100 women at minimum, and those women had to be replaced regularly because the system consumed them. Disease, addiction, physical deterioration, and death created a constant turnover that demanded a constant supply of new arrivals. The pipeline existed because the math demanded it. The cattle towns needed women the way factories needed raw materials, in bulk, on schedule, and at the lowest possible cost. And like any industrial supply chain, the pipeline that delivered those women was built on efficiency rather than ethics. The question was never whether the women would be harmed. The question was how to manage that harm, so that each woman remained productive for as long as possible before she needed to be replaced. Recruitment was the first stage of the pipeline, and it operated with a sophistication that would have been familiar to any industrial recruiter of the era. The saloon owners needed a steady supply of young women. The young women they needed were concentrated in eastern and midwestern cities where wages were low, opportunities were scarce, and desperation was a renewable resource. The connection between supply and demand was made through the most powerful communication technology of the 19th century, the newspaper advertisement. These advertisements appeared in papers across the country, in St. Louis, Chicago, Cincinnati, New Orleans, San Francisco, and dozens of smaller cities where working-class women read the employment listings the way a drowning person watches the shoreline, scanning desperately for anything that might represent solid ground. The language was carefully constructed. Wanted, respectable young women for hospitality work in thriving Western communities. Wanted, women of good character for hotel and dining service. Wanted, female attendants for entertainment establishments. Every word was chosen to imply respectability without guaranteeing it, to suggest legitimate employment without legally promising it, to attract women who would never have responded to an honest description of what was actually waiting for them at the end of that train ride. The train ticket was a hook. It was always included, always emphasized, always presented as proof of the employer's generosity and the legitimacy of the offer. A real employer pays your way. A real employer invests in you. The ticket cost between $15 and $40 depending on the distance, a sum representing weeks or even months of wages for the women reading that advertisement. It removed the one barrier that geography placed between the woman and the job. It also created the debt that would become the first link in the chain that bound her the moment she arrived. The recruiting agents were the human face of the pipeline. Some were men employed directly by saloon owners. Others were independent operators supplying women to multiple establishments across several towns, earning a commission for each delivery the way a livestock broker earned his cut for each head of cattle delivered to a railhead. Some agents were women, former saloon workers themselves who had aged out of the system and found that recruiting replacements was the only marketable skill they had left. The female agents were particularly effective because their presence reassured potential recruits. A woman offering a job to another woman felt safer than a man doing the same thing. The trust was manufactured, but it worked every time. The agents identified their targets through methods that varied in sophistication, but shared one common principle. They looked for vulnerability. A woman working double shifts in a factory was vulnerable. A war widow with children and no income was vulnerable. An immigrant who spoke limited English and had no family network was vulnerable. A young woman who had recently arrived in the city and hadn't yet found her footing was vulnerable. The agents found these women in boarding houses, in factory yards during shift changes, in immigrant processing centers, in churches where charitable organizations tried and consistently failed to meet the crushing demand for help. They approached with sympathy. They listened to problems. They offered solutions. And the solution was always the same: a better life out west good wages, room and board included, a fresh start in a place where the past couldn't follow you. The women who accepted, and thousands did, across the decades as Pipeline operated, boarded westbound trains carrying everything they owned and a set of expectations that would not survive the first hour after arrival. Some traveled alone. Some traveled in groups assembled by the agent, small clusters of strangers bound together by the same advertisement and the same hope. The journey took days. The landscape outside the train windows shifted from the dense, familiar clutter of eastern cities to the vast, open emptiness of plains, a transformation that should have felt like a warning, but instead felt like confirmation that something new was finally beginning. They were leaving the old world behind. Something new was waiting. The agent had promise. What was actually waiting was a man with a ledger, a building with no hotel sign, and a system that had processed a woman ahead of them, and would process the woman behind them with the same mechanical indifference the railroad applied to freight. The debt began before the woman even understood she was in debt. The train ticket was a foundation, the original charge upon which everything else would be built. $22, $30, $40. The amount varied by distance, but the principle never changed. You owe us for bringing you here. That was the first number entered into the ledger the saloon owner maintained for every woman in his establishment, a ledger that functioned simultaneously as an accounting document and a certificate of ownership. Upon arrival, additional charges were explained. She needed a dress suitable for work. The saloon owner provided one on credit at a price 2 or 3 times what the same garment would cost at any dry goods store in town. $12 for a dress worth $4. She needed shoes. Another charge. She needed cosmetics, hairpins, ribbons, every material required to present herself exactly as the saloon expected. Each item was entered into the ledger. She needed a room. The saloon provided one, a small space on the upper floor or in an adjacent building, charged at weekly rates that exceeded what a decent boarding house in the same town would have cost. She needed food. The saloon provided meals, charged at prices that bore no relationship to the actual cost of preparation. Laundry, charged. Soap and candles, charged. Every basic necessity of survival was provided by the owner, and every provision was converted directly into debt. The genius of the system was its apparent reasonableness. Each individual charge could be justified on its own. Of course you need a dress. Of course you need a room. Of course we have to charge you. We are a business, not a charity. Any woman who questioned a single line item was met with logic that was genuinely difficult to argue against in isolation. It was only when all the charges were added together and measured against the income the system actually allowed her to earn that the trap became fully visible. And by the time it was visible, it had already closed. The income came through commissions. A woman earned percentage of every drink she sold, every dance ticket she collected, every transaction she facilitated. The percentages varied by establishment, but the structure was always consistent. A drink commission might be 5 or 10 cents. A dance ticket might earn her 25 cents. On a busy night during cattle season, a woman working steadily from sundown to 2 in the morning could generate several dollars in commissions. It sounded like reasonable money, and by the standard of the era, it was reasonable money. The problem was never the income. The problem was the outflow. Each week, the owner deducted room charges, food charges, laundry charges, dress payments, and miscellaneous fees from the woman's earnings. And those deductions consistently exceeded the commissions. A woman who earned $8 in a week might find $12 in charges deducted from her account. The debt grew by $4. The following week, the same. The week after, the same. Each month she worked increased her debt rather than reducing it. The math was not accidental. It was engineered with the same precision a factory owner applied to wage calculations, calibrated so that the worker produced profit for the owner while never accumulating enough surplus to achieve independence. Some women recognized the trap quickly. They demanded to see the ledger. The owner showed it willingly, because the ledger confirmed exactly what he claimed. Here are your earnings. Here are your charges. Here is your balance. The numbers were real. The charges were documented. The system was not based on fraud in any legal sense. It was based on economic architecture, on the deliberate construction of a financial environment where the rules were technically fair and the outcome was predetermined. A woman who studied that ledger would see that she owed more this month than last. She would see that her earnings were real, but structurally insufficient. She would see that the path to clearing her debt extended into a future that receded just as fast as she walked toward it. And she would understand, with a cold clarity that no amount of prior suspicion could have prepared her for, that she was not an employee. She was inventory. And inventory does not pay off its purchase price. Inventory generates revenue until it is used up, and then it is replaced. The debt also served as a legal weapon. Territorial courts recognized debt contracts as binding obligations. A woman who fled a saloon without clearing her balance could be legally pursued as a debtor. And in towns where the saloon owner funded the sheriff and sat on the town council, that pursuit was not a theoretical possibility. It was a guarantee. Women who attempted to leave were intercepted, returned, and fined for the disruption their absence had caused. The fine was added to the debt. The attempt to escape made the escape harder. Every act of resistance tightened the system's grip rather than loosening it. The pretty waiter girl system was the first operational stage of the pipeline, the phase where a woman's labor began generating revenue for the saloon, while the system simultaneously began generating something inside her that would make every later stage possible. Dependency. The title itself was part of the deception. Pretty waiter girl. It sounded almost innocent. A young woman serving drinks in a lively establishment. The reality was a carefully engineered process that used alcohol as both product and weapon, extracting profit from the woman's social labor while systematically destroying her capacity to resist what came next. Her job was to circulate among the customers, sit with them, talk with them, laugh at their jokes, listen to their stories, and above all, persuade them to keep drinking. Every drink a customer purchased while in her company earned her a commission. The more he drank, the more she earned, the more the saloon earned. She was a sales tool disguised as companionship. Her smile was inventory. Her attention was a product sold by the glass. But there was one requirement that transformed this arrangement from unpleasant work into a mechanism of physical destruction. The woman was expected to drink with her customers, not to pretend to drink, not to hold a glass of colored water while the customer consumed whiskey, though some women attempted exactly that deception and were punished when discovered. She was expected to consume actual alcohol, glass for glass, round for round, night after night, because a woman who drank would man encourage him to drink more, stay longer, and spend more money. The owner monitored consumption. A woman whose customers were drinking alone was not doing her job. A woman whose glass stayed full while her companions emptied was not doing her job. The job required her to poison herself incrementally, one glass at a time, as a condition of employment. The effects were predictable, and they were rapid. A woman consuming significant quantities of whiskey every single night developed tolerance first, then dependency, then need. Within weeks, the alcohol was no longer something she consumed because the job required it. It was something she consumed because her body demanded it. The shaking that began each morning before the first drink. The nausea that only receded when a glass was in her hand. The inability to sleep without it, to function without it, to face another evening of performing warmth and companionship for strangers without the chemical buffer that made the performance bearable. The saloon provided the alcohol freely when she was working and charged her for it when she was not. Either way, the owner controlled the supply, and controlling the supply meant controlling the woman. This was not an unintended consequence. It was the system's central mechanism. A woman dependent on alcohol provided by her employer could not leave that employer without confronting withdrawal symptoms that frontier medicine had no effective treatment for. The dependency was a chain more effective than iron, because it operated from inside the woman's own body. She did not need to be locked in a room. She did not need to be physically restrained. She needed a drink, and the drink was behind the bar, and the bar was in the saloon. And the saloon was the only place in a cattle town where a woman with her debts, her dependency, and her reputation could access what her body now required simply to function. The pretty waiter girl system did not just generate revenue from alcohol sales. It generated captives from alcohol dependency. Every glass she raised to her lips tightened the system's grip by one more degree. So gradually, so consistently, that the transition from employee to prisoner happened without a single visible moment of change. The physical toll became impossible to hide within months. Skin that had been clear became blotched and swollen. Eyes that had been bright turned dull and bloodshot. Hands that had been steady developed tremors that worsened throughout the day until the evening's first glass steadied them temporarily. Weight fluctuated. Appetite disappeared entirely. The body aged at a rate that outpaced the calendar by years. A woman of 23 who had entered the system just 6 months earlier could pass for 35 under the dim lamplight of the saloon. The establishment's only mercy, hiding in its dimness what daylight would have revealed without pity. And when the deterioration reached a point where she could no longer attract customers as a pretty waiter girl, when the men at the bar began requesting younger, fresher companions, and her commission earnings fell below whatever threshold the owner considered productive, she was not released from her debt and sent on her way. She was moved to the next stage, the dance hall, where the boundaries shifted again, where the contact became physical, and where the pipeline carried her one step further from the door she had walked through 6 months or a year ago, believing she was entering a hotel. The dance halls operated under names that suggested entertainment: variety theaters, social halls, hurdy-gurdy houses. The names implied choice festivity, a night out. The reality was a transitional space designed to move women from selling companionship across a table to selling it across a body, and from there to selling it behind a closed door. The mechanics were straightforward. A customer purchased a dance ticket from a bar, typically for 25 to 50 cents. He presented the ticket to the woman of his choice. They danced. The dance lasted between 1 and 3 minutes, depending on the establishment. When the music stopped, the woman collected the ticket, redeemed at the bar for her share, and the process began again. On a busy night, a woman might dance 40 or 50 times. Her feet bled inside her shoes. Her back ached from being pulled and turned by men who handled her with the casual familiarity of people handling something they had purchased, which, in the transaction reality of the dance hall, they had. Her arms were bruised from grips that tightened when the whiskey was working and only loosened when the music stopped, and the man needed both hands to reach for his next ticket. But the dance itself was the least of it. What the dance hall truly introduced was sustained physical contact with strangers as a normalized condition of work. A woman who had spent months behind a bar had learned to smile, to talk, to pour. The dance hall taught her body a different lesson entirely, that it would be held by hands she had not chosen, that it would be pressed against bodies she did not want near her, that the space between her skin and a stranger's skin would be measured in fractions of an inch for hours every night, and that she had no authority to increase that distance because the ticket in his hand had purchased the right to close it. This was the escalation the pipeline required. Each stage moved the boundary of what was expected from a woman, and each stage moved in exactly the same direction. Talk became touch. Touch became proximity. Proximity became intimacy. The transitions were gradual enough that no single night felt like a dramatic violation. Each night felt only marginally different from the one before it. But the cumulative distance traveled across weeks and months was enormous, and it was engineered to move in only one direction. The private rooms accelerated the journey. Most dance halls maintained rooms on the upper floor or in a connected building where women could accompany clients after dances. These were not the cribs that represented the pipeline's final stage, but they were close enough. They had doors that closed. They had beds, and they were available to any woman willing to use them. Willing being a word that carried a very specific meaning inside the debt system. The commission for a private session was significantly higher than for dancing. A woman who spent 30 minutes in a private room earned more than she could earn in an entire evening on the dance floor. The math was deliberate. The system made the private rooms the most efficient path for a woman to address her debt. It did not force her through the door. It simply made that door the only rational choice available to a person drowning in numbers that climbed no matter how many tickets she collected. Some women resisted. They stayed on the dance floor. They endured the hands, the proximity, the aching feet, and told themselves that this was a line they would not cross. The system had a quiet, clinical answer for that resistance. It was not dramatic. It was arithmetic. A woman who refused private sessions earned less. A woman who earned less fell further behind on her debt. A woman who fell further behind was informed by the owner that her progress was unsatisfactory, that her position in the establishment was in jeopardy, that there were other women willing to work harder who could replace her. The threat was not violence. It was abandonment, expulsion from the saloon with an unpaid debt in a town where every sheriff, every judge, and every landlord knew exactly what an unpaid saloon debt meant. Cast out into a cattle town with no money, no references, no reputation, and a debt that would follow her into whatever future she tried to build. For most women, the private room was less frightening than that alternative, and so they went through the door, and the pipeline carried them forward. The cribs were the end of the line, the final destination of a journey that had begun with a newspaper advertisement, a train ticket, and a man in a clean shirt quietly explaining that how quickly the debt cleared depended entirely on how hard she was willing to work. By the time a woman reached the cribs, the pipeline had already accomplished most of its work. It had separated her from her former life. It had buried her in debt she could not repay. It had made her dependent on alcohol she could not obtain without the owner's cooperation. It had moved her body through a series of escalating contacts that erased boundaries so gradually that no single night felt like the moment of her destruction. The cribs did not destroy her. The cribs were where the system housed what remained after the destruction was substantially complete. The physical spaces were consistent across the cattle towns. Small rooms built in rows behind or adjacent to main saloon, access through a back door or a narrow alley that kept the traffic separate from the establishment's more public operations. Each crib measured roughly 6 by 8 feet, an iron bed frame, sometimes bolted to the floor, a wash basin on a small table, a mirror, though some women turned theirs to face the wall, a curtain or a thin wooden door that provided the idea of privacy without its substance. The walls were bare plank. Sound passed through them without resistance. A woman in one crib could hear everything happening in the cribs on either side of her. Privacy was not something the architecture was designed to provide, because privacy implied autonomy, and autonomy was incompatible with what the system required. The women in the cribs served clients sent directly from the saloon's main bar. A man paid the bartender. The bartender directed him to a crib. The entire transaction was managed by the establishment rather than by the woman, which meant she had no authority to refuse a client, to set conditions, to negotiate, or to end an encounter once it had begun. She was the last link in a chain of transactions that started at the bar and ended in her room, and her role in that chain was to deliver what had been purchased without complaint. Refusal was punished, sometimes with fines added to the debt, sometimes with confinement in a back room until the woman agreed to resume work, sometimes with beatings administered by the saloon's enforcers, men employed specifically to ensure that the pipeline's product remained functional and compliant. The hours were determined by demand rather than by any consideration of the woman's endurance. During cattle season, when cowboys arrived with months of accumulated wages, the cribs operated continuously from evening through dawn. A woman might serve 10 or 15 clients in a single night. Sleep was taking the gaps between them, broken, insufficient, interrupted by the knock on the door or the pulling back of the curtain that meant another man had paid at the bar and was standing in her doorway. The revenue the cribs generated was enormous relative to the cost of maintaining them. A woman serving 10 clients a night at $1 per transaction produced $10 in revenue per evening. The owner's cost of the crib itself, built from scrap lumber for almost nothing, and the woman's food, alcohol, and whatever minimal medical attention was required to keep her working when disease threatened to take her offline. The profit margin was higher than any other operation the saloon conducted, higher than the bar, higher than the gambling tables, higher than the dance hall. The cribs were the economic engine driving the entire establishment, which is precisely why the pipeline existed in the first place. Everything that came before, the recruitment, the debt, the pretty waiter stage, the dance hall, was infrastructure. Infrastructure designed to deliver women to the cribs in a condition where they would comply, without requiring the kind of open physical coercion that might attract unwanted attention from the outside world. The system was elegant in its cruelty. By the time a woman reached the cribs, she had been inside the pipeline long enough that her options had narrowed to a single point. She could not leave because her debt was insurmountable. She could not function without alcohol that only the owner controlled. She could not seek help from law enforcement that was financially dependent on the very economy that consumed her. She could not return to her former life, because months or years had passed, and whatever she left behind had closed over her absence the way water closes over stone. She could not even fully articulate what had been done to her, because the pipeline had not operated through a single dramatic act of violence that could be named and reported. It had operated through 1,000 small increments, each one barely distinguishable from the one before, accumulating into a captivity so total that it felt less like imprisonment and more like gravity. Something that simply was. Something you stopped fighting, because fighting it felt like fighting the weight of your own body. Think about that for a moment. A system so precisely designed that every stage prepared the woman psychologically for the next, so that the final destination never felt like a sudden fall, but like the last step on a very long staircase that had been leading here from the beginning. She had been descending so gradually that she could not identify the moment she started going down. The pipeline did not need chains. It did not need locks. It needed patience, arithmetic, and the understanding that a human being can be moved from freedom to total captivity one small concession at a time, as long as each concession is made to feel like the only reasonable choice available. Let me know in the comments where you think the point of no return was. The train ticket, the first drink, the first dance, the first private room, because the women inside the system could not answer that question either. And the reason they could not answer it is exactly the reason the system worked. But the pipeline had one more tool, one more mechanism that completed the architecture of captivity so thoroughly that even women who clearly saw the trap, who understood every element of its design, still could not walk away, because debt imprisoned the finances. The dance hall imprisoned the body, and what came next imprisoned the blood. Laudanum was the pipeline's invisible architecture, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, available without prescription at any general store or pharmacy in the United States throughout the entire 19th century. It cost pennies per dose. It was marketed as medicine for everything from headaches to menstrual pain to infant teething. And in the saloons of the cattle towns, it was the most effective tool of control ever devised by men who understood that the cheapest prison is the one the prisoner builds inside her own body. The introduction was gradual, almost gentle, the way everything in the pipeline was gradual. A woman in the pretty waiter stage, complaining of headaches from the nightly drinking, was offered a few drops of laudanum in warm water. A woman in the dance hall, whose feet and back ached from hours of being pulled across a wooden floor, was given a spoonful before her shift. A woman in the cribs who could not face another night without something to blunt the reality of what was happening in her room was handed a small brown bottle and told to take what she needed. The first doses were free. They were presented as kindness, as an employer taking care of his workers, as relief offered without strings. The strings appeared later, once the relief had become necessity. Opium dependency develops with a speed and certainty that 19th century medicine did not fully understand, but that saloon owners understood with the practical expertise of men who had watched the process repeat itself dozens of times. Within weeks of regular use, the woman's body adjusted to the drug's presence and began to require it for normal function. Without it, withdrawal began within hours. Muscle cramps that made standing impossible, Nausea so severe that eating became an ordeal. Sweating, shaking, and a deep bone pain that felt like the skeleton was trying to tear free of the flesh holding it together. And above all, a psychological desperation, a need so consuming that every single thought bent toward the next dose the way a compass needle bends toward north. The owner controlled the supply. That was the entire point. A woman who needed laudanum to function could not leave the building where laudanum was available. She did not need to be chained. She did not need to be locked in a room. She needed what the owner had, and the owner dispensed it according to her compliance. Work your shift and the bottle is waiting. Refuse a client and the bottle disappears. Try to leave and the withdrawal begins before you reach the edge of town. The chemical chain was more efficient than iron, more reliable than debt, and more invisible than any physical restraint. A person walking past a saloon on any given evening would see a woman serving drinks or dancing with customer and see nothing that looked remotely like captivity. The captivity was inside her. It traveled with her wherever she went. It required no maintenance and no enforcement because a woman's own nervous system had become the jailer. Morphine arrived later, for women in the advanced stages of the pipeline whose tolerance for laudanum had increased to the point where the tincture no longer provided adequate relief. Morphine was stronger, faster, administered by injection rather than ingestion, and even more rapidly addictive. Some saloon owners employed men specifically to administer those injections, controlling not just the supply, but the delivery itself. The woman became dependent not only on the drug, but on the specific person who provided it. She was bound by chemistry to the building and by necessity to the people inside it. The drugs served a second function beyond control. They made the work survivable. A woman numbed by laudanum could endure what a sober woman simply could not, and that endurance was worth far more to the owner than any amount of physical restraint ever could have been. She could lie in that crib while a stranger used her body and experience at a distance, muffled, as though it were happening to someone else in another room. The drugs did not eliminate the horror. They wrapped it in a fog thick enough to make it possible to keep living through it without the kind of psychological collapse that would have rendered her useless to the owner. He needed her functional. The drugs kept her functional. That they also kept her captive was not a side effect. It was a design. The women who recognized what was happening, who understood that the laudanum was a trap as deliberate as the debt, faced a choice that was not really a choice at all. Stop taking the drug and face withdrawal so severe that working became impossible, which meant no earnings, which meant the debt grew faster, which meant punishment for non-productivity. Or continue taking the drug and accept that the chain would tighten with every dose until leaving the saloon was not merely difficult, but physiologically impossible. There was no third option. The system had made sure of that, and for the women who resisted anyway, who pushed back despite the debt, despite the dependency, despite the isolation, the pipeline had prepared for them too. The punishments were not improvised responses to unexpected defiance. They were built into the system the way the debt was built into the ledger, anticipated, budgeted for, and ready to deploy the moment a woman tested the walls of her confinement. The most common punishment was economic, a fine, another entry in a ledger the woman was already drowning in. Refuse a client, $5 fine. Late to the floor, $2 fine. Spoke to a customer about conditions in the establishment, $10 fine. Attempted to leave without clearing her balance, $20 fine. Each fine was small enough to seem proportionate and large enough to push the debt further beyond any realistic possibility of repayment. A woman who attempted to escape and was caught might find that a single evening of defiance added more to her debt than a full month of labor could reduce. Resistance was literally more expensive than compliance. Every act of rebellion purchased additional captivity. When economic punishment proved insufficient, the saloon's enforcers provided physical alternatives. These men were employed at most establishments of significant size. Their official function was security. Their unofficial function was discipline. Court records from Kansas, Colorado, and Montana territories contained testimony describing exactly what enforcers did to women who refused to work. beatings administered in back rooms, away from the saloon floor where customers might be disturbed. Women struck with fists, with belts, with wooden handles kept for purposes that had nothing to do with construction. Experienced enforcers understood where to hit, so that the damage was felt but not visible. A bruise on the body could be hidden beneath clothing. A bruise on the face reduced a woman's ability to attract clients. The skill was learned through practice. Confinement was the next level. Women who refused to work after a beating were locked in back rooms or cellars for hours, sometimes days, without food, without water, and in some cases without the laudanum their bodies now chemically required, which meant confinement triggered withdrawal on top of everything else. Compounding the punishment with a biological cruelty the enforcer did not need to administer personally. A woman locked in a cellar, experiencing opium withdrawal, did not need to be beaten into submission. Her own body beat her. After 24 or 48 hours of shaking, vomiting, and deep bone agony, most women agreed to return to work. Women who attempted to seek help outside the saloon found that the pipeline had sealed those exits too. Town marshals and sheriffs in cattle towns were funded by the same saloon economy. They would have needed to investigate. A sheriff who moved against a saloon owner was a sheriff who had attacked the economic foundation of his own salary. Women who approached law enforcement were told that debt disputes were civil matters, that their contracts were binding, that leaving without payment constituted theft, and that whatever was happening inside that saloon was not a problem the law was equipped or inclined to solve. Some women tried to leave town entirely. They walked toward the train station, toward the edge of town, or simply out into the open prairie, in any direction that wasn't the direction of the saloon. The pipeline had anticipated this too. Enforcers monitored the roads and the station. A man on horseback could cover any route out of town faster than a woman on foot. Women intercepted attempting to flee were returned, fined, sometimes beaten, sometimes confined, and always the debt grew. The attempt to escape was converted into a tighter chain, another number in the ledger, another year added to a sentence that carried no end date. The pipeline consumed women the way a furnace consumes fuel, efficiently, completely, and with no mechanism for what remained after the burning was done. The system that had been so meticulously designed to recruit, trap, and exploit had no corresponding design for what happened when a woman was used up. It simply expelled her and moved on. The deterioration followed a pattern so consistent it constituted a timeline. Alcohol damage came first. Liver function declining, skin yellowing, hands trembling through the morning hours until the first drink steadied them temporarily. Drug dependency compounded the damage, layering opium's slow erosion on top of whiskey's faster destruction. Venereal disease, inevitable given the volume of unprotected contact the cribs demanded, introduced infections that frontier medicine could not cure and barely attempted to treat. Mercury compounds were the standard remedy. They caused hair loss, tooth loss, kidney damage, and neurological deterioration that mimicked madness. The treatment was nearly as destructive as the disease itself. Tuberculosis found easy prey in women whose immune systems had been shattered by malnutrition, chemical dependency, and the airless confines of rooms where ventilation was a concept the architecture did not recognize. A woman who entered the pipeline at 20 might reach the end of her commercial usefulness by 25 or 26. 5 years. That was the average working life the system extracted before the body depended on could no longer perform. 5 years of nightly labor in the cribs. 5 years of alcohol and laudanum and mercury treatments, and inadequate food and sleep measured in minutes rather than hours. By the end of those 5 years, the woman who had stepped off a westbound train carrying a carpet bag and a set of expectations was physically unrecognizable. Not metaphorically, but literally. The face that had attracted customers 2 years earlier now repelled them. The body that had generated $10 a night now generated complaints. The product had degraded beyond the point of commercial viability, and the system that had invested so heavily in acquiring and maintaining that product had no further use for it. The first stage of disposal was the downward sale. A woman, too deteriorated for a Front Street saloon in Dodge City still held value at a lesser establishment in a smaller town. The owner sold her debt to an operator in a place where standards were lower and customers were less selective. She was transported to her new location the same way she had been transported to her first, as inventory in transit. The new establishment was worse, smaller, dirtier, more violent. The clients were rougher because the towns were rougher. The owner was less invested in maintaining her because she had cost him less to acquire. She was a discounted asset purchased at salvage value, and she was managed accordingly. When the first resale destination was exhausted, there was often a second and a third. Each step down the ladder carried the woman further from civilization and closer to margins where the frontier dissolved into empty territory. From a cattle town to a mining camp. From a mining camp to a railroad construction site. From a construction site to a trading post at the edge of nowhere. Each transfer reduced her value, her conditions, and her remaining lifespan. The pipeline did not end at a single clean point. It tapered, narrowing from the relative visibility of Front Street to the absolute invisibility of a shack in a canyon where no one who was not already there would ever go. Women who could not be sold at any price were expelled from the system entirely, turned out of the establishment with nothing, no money, since the debt had consumed every cent she had ever earned and more. No possessions beyond the clothes she wore, which belonged to the owner and were sometimes reclaimed before she was pushed out the door. No health, since the years inside the pipeline had damaged her body beyond what rest or nutrition could repair. No connections, since everyone she had known before the pipeline had long since lost track of her, and everyone she knew inside it was trapped in the same system she was leaving. Some of these women found their way to the charitable organizations beginning to appear in the larger western towns by the 1880s and 1890s. Church missions, women's aid societies, organizations run by reformers who understood exactly what the pipeline was and who tried, with limited resources and against enormous institutional resistance, to help the women it discarded. But most did not reach these organizations. Most disappeared into the margins of frontier society, surviving for weeks or months through whatever means remained available to a woman with no money, no health, and no place in a community that had profited from her destruction and now preferred not to be reminded that she existed. The last stage of the pipeline was the quietest. No enforcers, no ledgers, no fines, just a woman dying in a place where no one who knew her real name would ever think to look. Liver failure from years of forced alcohol consumption, organ damage from laudanum and morphine dependency, venereal disease that had progressed untreated through every stage of the pipeline, tuberculosis coughed through hundreds of nights in unventilated cribs, violence, sometimes from clients, sometimes from owners, sometimes from other women competing for survival in spaces too small for the number of bodies the system forced into them. And suicide. The court records and newspaper archives of the cattle towns contain notices of women's deaths that coroners classified as accidental overdose, but whose circumstances suggest something else entirely. A woman found dead in a crib with an empty laudanum bottle beside her. A woman found in an alley behind a saloon in winter, inadequately dressed, having lain down in freezing temperatures and never stood up again. A woman pulled from a river at the edge of town. Accidental, the coroner wrote. Case closed. The frontier physicians who practiced in the cattle towns occasionally documented the mortality patterns they observed among women in the saloon system. Their observations survive in scattered medical correspondence and in the records of territorial health boards beginning to form in the 1880s. The numbers they reported were alarming even by the standards of an era when life expectancy was shorter and medical care was primitive. Women in the saloon system died at rates that dwarfed every other demographic group in the cattle towns, higher than cowboys who faced stampedes, river crossings, and violent confrontations as daily occupational hazards, higher than miners working underground in conditions that produced lung disease and collapse, higher than soldiers stationed at frontier forts in hostile territory. The women in the pipeline were the most at-risk population on the entire American frontier, and the least documented. They died faster than anyone else and left fewer records of their existence than anyone else. That combination was not coincidental. The system that killed them was the same system that ensured their deaths went uncounted. The burials reflected the erasure. Every cattle town of significant size maintained an informal cemetery on its outskirts where the people of respectable society would not claim were interred. Boot Hill, the name applied to these burial grounds across the West, received the gamblers who died in car disputes, the cowboys who died in saloon brawls, the drifters who died of exposure, and the women who died of everything the pipeline had done to them. The graves were shallow. The markers were wooden when they existed at all, pine board with names scratched or painted in letters that weathered away within a few seasons. Many graves had no marker at all. Many markers bore names that were not real. Working names of women had used in the saloons rather than the names their mothers had given them. Some markers said only unknown, followed by a date. At Dodge City's Boot Hill, in active use from 1872 to 1878, the burial records list women by first name only in most cases. Frankie. Ida, a woman identified only as Squirrel Tooth Alice. Another known simply as Big Nose Kate. Names that were labels rather than identities, assigned by the system that had used these women and carried into the ground that received them. Behind each one was a woman who had once had a family, a hometown, a real name, and a life that existed before the pipeline claimed her. That prior life is unrecoverable. The pipeline did not merely kill these women. It erased the people they had been before it killed the people they became. Frontier archaeologists working at Boot Hill sites and at locations identified as former saloon and crib districts have found what the records could not preserve: human remains in unmarked graves. Skeletal evidence of malnutrition, disease, and physical trauma entirely consistent with the conditions the pipeline produced. Bone damage patterns that tell stories the women themselves were never given the opportunity to tell. They are fragments, incomplete, waiting for the kind of systematic investigation that funding and public interest have never sufficiently provided. The ground holds what the records do not, and the ground has been patient. Now let me take you back to Dodge City, back to Front Street, back to Mattie Ross, standing behind a bar in the summer of 1878, pouring whiskey into glasses that never seemed to stay full, wearing a dress she was still paying for, carrying a debt that grew each week regardless of how many drinks she served, how many dances she endured, or how many times she climbed the stairs to the rooms above the dance hall, because the commission from a private session was the only number in that ledger that came anywhere close to matching the charges the owner added to her account every Monday morning. Mattie's story follows the pattern, because the pattern was the product. She moved from the bar to the dance floor within 2 months of arrival, from the dance floor to the private rooms within 4. The laudanum appeared around the 3rd month, offered for the headaches the nightly drinking produced, accepted gratefully, needed desperately by the 5th month, required for basic function by the 6th. Each stage felt like a decision she was making. Each decision felt like the only reasonable option available. The pipeline did not drag her. It tilted the floor beneath her feet and let gravity do the work. Her name appears only in the margins of the kind of documents that preserve the existence of women the cattle towns did not consider worth recording properly. A line in a saloon ledger, a mention in a court filing related to a property dispute between the saloon's owner and a creditor, a brief entry in the records of a women's aid society that operated briefly in Dodge City in the early 1880s. These fragments do not tell her full story. They tell only that she existed, that she was inside the system, and that at some point she was no longer inside it. The gap between those two facts is a silence the historical record does not fill. She either left, was sold, was expelled, or died. The pipeline did not distinguish between these outcomes in its record-keeping, because the pipeline did not keep records of outcomes. It kept records of revenue. When the revenue stopped, so did the record-keeping. Mattie Ross was one woman. The pipeline processed thousands across the cattle towns of Kansas, the mining camps of Colorado and Montana, the railroad towns of Nebraska and Wyoming, the boom towns of the Dakotas and the Arizona Territory. The system operated simultaneously in hundreds of establishments for roughly 3 decades, from the end of the Civil War to the closing of the frontier in the 1890s. Each establishment maintained between 5 and 20 women at any given time. Each woman lasted an average of 3 to 5 years before she was sold down, expelled, or buried. The math produces a number that no historian has ever been able to calculate precisely, because the records were never designed to allow it. But even conservative estimates suggest that tens of thousands of women passed through the Saloon pipeline during its decades of operation. Tens of thousands of women recruited through deception, trapped through debt, broken through alcohol and drugs and escalating exploitation, and discarded when the breaking was complete. Not one of them appears in the version of the Old West that America chose to remember. Dodge City is a tourist town now. You can walk Front Street and photograph buildings reconstructed to look exactly as they did in 1878. You can visit the Boot Hill Museum and see artifacts from the Cattle Drive era displayed behind glass. You can watch a stage gunfight performed by actors in period costume, buy a souvenir shot glass, and eat a steak at a restaurant named after a famous lawman. The town has made its history into entertainment, which is what America has always done with the parts of its past that are too profitable to ignore and too painful to tell honestly. The women are not in the museum. They are not in the reenactments. They are not on the historical markers, the interpretive signs, or the walking tour brochures. They are in the ground beneath the streets and parking lots and tourist shops of a town that was built on their labor, sustained by their suffering, and has spent 150 years insisting they were there by choice. They were not there by choice. They were there by design, by arithmetic, by a system so thorough and so calculated that it transformed a newspaper advertisement into a death sentence and called the entire process employment. If what you've learned today matters to you, and it should, subscribe to Sinister Empires right now and hit that notification bell, because the stories buried beneath America's favorite myths are exactly the ones that most need to be excavated. Share this video with anyone who has ever watched a Western and believed that the women in those saloons were free. Like this video if you think their story deserves to be heard. And drop a comment below telling me which stage of this pipeline disturbed you the most. And tell me what city or country you're watching from, because these women were erased once by the system that destroyed them and erased again by the history that forgot them. They do not deserve a third erasure. The cattle towns were not the only places where America built systems to exploit and discard women on an industrial scale. There is another chapter from another corner of the frontier where the methods were different and the silence was even deeper. That story is waiting for you on your screen right now. Click it and discover what else was buried.